Tim Pasakarnis. I'm a water resources analyst with the Cape Cod Commission. And we're going to talk about the Cape Cod Aquifer system this morning, a little bit about the aquifer itself, and then what it means as far as a drinking water resource for the Cape. So we will see if I can get the slides advancing. All right, so let's talk about the aquifer is a component of the larger water cycle or hydrologic cycle, right? And that is all of the ongoing processes that move water, really throughout kind of different reservoirs all over the planet. And this is something that certainly we've probably all seen before. But this diagram in particular does a nice job of showing how water moves through the atmosphere, out of surface waters through evaporation into the atmosphere, into clouds, how it is returned to the land surface through precipitation. And once that happens, it can either run off overland, across the land surface, where it can travel to, creeks, streams, but it can also infiltrate. And on Cape Cod, that's really the dominant kind of pathway for precipitation that falls, is because of the geology and the soils we have on Cape Cod. There's relatively little runoff over the land surface. Most of it infiltrates, through the soils and into the water table. And that's, when we talk about the Cape Cod aquifer, that's the water table, the groundwater, the aquifer. They're all the same thing. They're different terms for the same thing, which is just almost like an underground reservoir of water that is contained, kind of within the spaces between the soil particles and the subsurface. And so let's look at the aquifer itself in a little bit more detail. So this kind of shows an idealized aquifer, and kind of the different ways that the aquifer can interact with the land surface and the topography above it. So just to go through a couple different elements of this, and hopefully you can see my mouse cursor as I point to the different parts of it. But in this diagram, there is an area which is referred to as the recharge area. And so that's basically where water that falls as precipitation infiltrates through the land surface into the aquifer. And you can kind of see it shows the pathway that water can take once it enters the aquifer. And that's shown by these dashed lines that basically, start traveling sort of downward, and then they kind of deflect and they can move laterally. And then when they get to a certain point, in this case, it's the discharge area is shown as a river. Water can actually flow back upwards, and it can flow out of the aquifer to a stream or some sort of receiving water. Or as we'll see later, a lot of the discharge from the Cape Cod aquifer actually goes to the coastal waters. And that's an idea that we're probably familiar with through all of the work of the 208 plan. A couple other things that I want to point out here from, from this kind of conceptual diagram. So there are, in a lot of aquifers, there can be confining layers. So that's sort of shown by these horizontal, lighter shaded kind of dashed stripes. And those can be areas maybe made of clay or silt or some basically materials that are lower permeability, so they don't allow water through as easily. And this is where you can hear kind of terms like confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers. So when you have these areas of low permeability with groundwater below it, they can essentially block flow of groundwater either, vertically or horizontally. So on Cape Cod, though we do not have very many of those kind of low permeability layers, and where we do, uh, they're not uniform. So what we see is that for the vast majority of the land on Cape Cod, the aquifer is considered unconfined, which means that it kind of communicates freely with the land surface above it. So precipitation readily infiltrates. And what that also means is there's nothing preventing, anything else besides rainwater from traveling through the land surface into the aquifer. And so that's one of the challenges. It's definitely a benefit because it is a highly productive aquifer, but it's also a challenge because it means it's vulnerable to inputs of anything undesirable, pollutants of any sort that are introduced to the land surface. And so that's something that we're going to revisit as we talk about some of the considerations for management of the water resources and land use. And just one last thing before we move on, you can see the different timescales on which groundwater travel can occur, depending on sort of where a particular flow path for groundwater is, whether it's located in one of those confined layers or not. On Cape Cod, the groundwater travel times can range anywhere from several months to approaching 100 years, so almost on that century time scale, uh, just depending on the location you're looking at and where it's discharging to. So just to give everyone a sense of kind of what types of time scales and how groundwater, the speed at which it flows. Okay, so let's look specifically now at Cape Cod. So what this diagram shows is basically a cross section of Cape Cod running more or less north to south, kind of in the Yarmouth area. So we have Cape Cod Bay here on the left and Nantucket Sound on the right. And this is basically the how the land surface changes running roughly from north to south. And then below that land surface, what's going on? So where does the water table sit? What is the elevation of the water table like? And we can see it doesn't always match the land surface. So that's something that can kind of be a little challenging to wrap your head around at first, because the water table itself kind of behaves much like water does anywhere else. It's driven by gravity, and so it flows from sort of high elevation to low elevation. But when I say that, we're talking about the elevation of that water surface below the land surface. So this is where sometimes we use similar terms for both the land and the water table, and it can get confusing. So hopefully, with this diagram and some of what we're going to go through, we'll hopefully make a little bit better sense of that. But basically, looking from north to south, this is pretty much the picture for all of the upper and mid Cape, which is kind of roughly with Route 6 as the dividing line. Um, any uh, any precipitation that falls and infiltrates kind of south of Route 6 roughly is going to slowly make its way towards Nantucket Sound, and north of Route 6 it's going to make its way toward Cape Cod Bay. And that corresponds to kind of the high point of the water table being, roughly where we see Route 6. One other thing to point out, because it is somewhat unique to Cape Cod, is the role of ponds and lakes and their connection to the aquifer. Uh, and you may have heard the term that freshwater ponds are windows into the aquifer, and that's because the majority of ponds on Cape Cod are both groundwater fed, so they don't have, most of them don't have streams or rivers that are discharging to them. The water that's coming into the pond is coming from the aquifer on what we call the upgradient side, which is basically like upstream, just in groundwater terms. And at the same time, the pond is also feeding back into the aquifer on the down gradient side. So what that means is certainly anything that's going into our ponds is also going into the aquifer, and vice versa. That if there are things happening up gradient of a pond, and those could be wastewater discharges, or those could be, any of the more uh, sort of problematic things we think of, like hazardous waste sites or spills or things of that nature. Those can also make their way through groundwater into the ponds. And then, of course, eventually, most of the groundwater flows to marine water resources of some sort. So really, the aquifer is kind of the mech or the it's the thing that ties all these water resources together and all of the kind of different subject areas that my department deals with, stormwater, drinking water, wastewater. All of those are somehow connected to the aquifer, which then connects them to our freshwater ponds, our coastal waters, all of those things. So that's why it's really important that we don't look too narrowly at any one of those, because they're all related to one another and have impacts on one another. Uh, One more thing I want to point out, and we're gonna get into, we're sort of working our way into a distinction that I think has been a little confusing. So while the behavior from a north-south perspective was pretty well described by that diagram I showed, uh, if we start to look sort of east to west, um, the behavior is a little different, because we do have these different lenses of the aquifer, and these lenses are, even though we sort of refer to it as a single aquifer, these lenses are distinct from one another, and they do not necessarily communicate hydraulically. And there are a number of hydraulic divides, and I thought this figure, which is from our updated ponds atlas, does a really nice job of showing kind of the different lenses, which are highlighted in this light blue, and the landscape features that really separate those lenses from one another. So Bass River, which separates the Sagamore and Monomoy lenses; Rock Harbor Creek, which separates the Monomoy from the Nauset; Blackfish Creek and Wellfleet, which separates the Chiquesset and Nauset lenses, and so on, all the way out to Pilgrim Lake in Provincetown. And so what that means is, if we look at, so this is again those same lenses, and what we're showing here is a water table elevation map. So you can read it kind of the same way if you've ever read a topographic map, where each one of those lines is showing an elevation contour, uh, but it's not the land surface elevation we're looking at. Again, we're looking at the water table elevation, which is underneath the land surface. And where the lines are really close to one another, that means that the water table surface is changing rapidly. And so you are going to see faster groundwater flow rates. And you can kind of, I've kind of ballparked, based on those contours in different areas, what direction groundwater might be flowing. And what you can see is, at each one of those hydraulic divides, like Bass River, you actually have groundwater flowing in two different directions, depending which side of the divide you're on. And really, the point that I hope this makes is that we talk about the Cape Cod aquifer system kind of as a single aquifer, as a sole source aquifer, which I'll get into the details of that in a minute. um, but the six lenses are distinct from one another, and hopefully this kind of shows that if you're in Provincetown, uh, basically getting water from the Pilgrim lens, you're not going to pull water from the Sagamore lens, because it would have to flow uphill here. It would have to flow essentially uphill here, and it would have to do that, on five different occasions. But I think it is challenging, given some of the terminology around it, to really make that point clear. So let's talk about that, right? Because the Cape Cod aquifer is designated as a sole source aquifer. And specifically, the sole source aquifer designation, that is a piece of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which defines what a sole source aquifer is. And really, the important parts about that are that the aquifer supplies at least 50% of the drinking water to its service area, and that there are no reasonably available alternatives if the aquifer basically becomes unavailable for drinking water use. And designation as a sole source aquifer basically precludes federal financial assistance for any project that may contaminate the aquifer, and it has some associated review processes in order to make that determination of projects that may contaminate the aquifer. So the Cape Cod Aquifer was designated as a sole source aquifer in 1982, and I think the actual text of that designation is helpful because it specifically says, for purposes of this designation, that the Cape Cod Aquifer is considered a single continuous aquifer. So it is a little bit of an administrative thing to call all six of those lenses a single aquifer. And certainly it makes sense because the situation is the same for all of them. They are the primary source of drinking water for all of those service areas, and there is not a reasonable surface water alternative available. Uh, but it can be a little confusing when all six of them are referred to as a single aquifer. Okay, so that kind of covers the aquifer basics portion of things. And we're going to start to move into the aquifer really through the lens of it as a drinking water resource. And we'll start with just looking at wells in general and how they impact aquifer systems. Again, we're looking at kind of a similar conceptual diagram to last time, where you have precipitation that can fall sort of anywhere on the land surface. And depending on where it falls, it will follow certain paths towards whatever its discharge area is. Again, it's kind of, could be shown here as kind of a coastal water, or it could be a stream, doesn't really matter. And once you introduce a well into that aquifer, it has the potential to kind of change some of those flow patterns, right? So you can see with the different arrows showing kind of the immediate impact in the area surrounding the well. Something else it can do is, if you look at this black dashed line, which represents the top of the water table, is it's also going to draw down the water table uh, in the vicinity of the well. Now, how sort of large that area of influence is depends on a number of factors, right? The size of the well, what the rate of pumping is, and then of course like the aquifer characteristics themselves. So this is just kind of a very basic example, but all of those sorts of things, kind of the size of the arrows, the area where the water table is pulled down, can change. But that's sort of the formation for how public supply wells are regulated. And so what I'm showing here is an image from Mass GIS, which shows in the center a couple of public supply wells. And it also shows the zone 1 area around those wells. So these are the circles that I've highlighted in yellow. And then also, if you can pick it up, it shows all of the zone 2s. And so this will be for both of these wells, but also potentially for other wells in the area, in this kind of pinkish cross-hatched area with, sort of a funny teardrop shape. And so to go into a little bit more detail on those zone 1, zone 2 protections for public supply wells. So those are managed through Mass DEP, through the Bureau of Resource Protection's Water Supply Division. And for public supply wells, they're required to have a zone 1, which is a 400-foot radius around the well, which works out to, roughly 11 acres. And that has to be controlled by the public water supplier. And so that is kind of the highest level of control over that immediate area around a supply well that is serving a community. And then for public water supplies that have a capacity or a permitted capacity of 100,000 gallons per day or greater, they're also required to delineate zone 2s for all of their wells. And the zone 2 definition is an area of an aquifer which contributes water to a well under the most severe pumping conditions that can be realistically anticipated. And so what does that mean? Basically, the modeling that goes into determining a zone 2 simulates 180 days of pumping at safe yield. So that's the maximum pumping rate that can be used without, resulting in a long-term depletion of the aquifer. So simulating half a year of pumping at that rate with no recharge from precipitation. And under those conditions, the entire area where that well could pull groundwater from, that's considered the zone 2 for it. And so zone 2s are afforded some protections. They're not quite as stringent as the zone 1s, but there are limits on wastewater flows. There are limits on the land uses that can occur within those zone 2s. And I'll just point out this image on the left shows all of the zone 2s on Cape Cod, and that represents a little over a quarter of the land surface that's within zone 2s to public water supply wells. And so the zone 2s that I just showed, those kind of correspond to this, this, which is what's the actual public water supply kind of organization and infrastructure look like for for the county as a whole. So public water supplies serve about 85% of Cape Cod. So there are some areas in East Sandwich, Wellfleet, Truro, and portions of Eastham largely that are still primarily served by private wells, with the rest of the county being served by public water supplies. And it's a mix of water districts, which are separate from kind of town government and town operations, and then also municipal divisions and municipal departments that are acting as community public water suppliers. Together, they all operate 160 gravel pack water supply wells. So those are wells that are withdrawing groundwater from the aquifer to provide drinking water. There's one surface reservoir, that's Long Pond in Falmouth. And the withdrawals for each of these districts, divisions, departments, and all of their wells are governed by the Water Management Act, which is administered through Mass DEP. And anticipating, to try and illustrate kind of the scale of just the drinking water, you know, industry as a whole, versus the aquifer itself. So on a daily average basis, about 450 million gallons of water enter the aquifer. And so that's precipitation, rain, snow, all kind of averaged out over a year. And the majority of that just flows directly to coastal waters, so almost 70%. 24% discharges to rivers and streams. So that's kind of from that initial diagram I showed, where groundwater just sort of flows uh, into a surface water and basically supplies it, raises the elevation of that surface water. And about 7% of that recharge is captured by public supply wells, which is still a pretty substantial, pretty substantial quantity of water. So what we found is that all of the community water suppliers, and again, so that doesn't include private wells, it doesn't include some smaller water suppliers that are not, considered public water supplies, but the public water supplies pump an average of 10.7 billion gallons per year. And what we've found is that over the last 20 years or so, that overall total has remained relatively constant. And so I don't mean it's 10.7 billion gallons every year. We certainly see fluctuations. There's a lot more withdrawn in dry years than there is in wet years, for obvious reasons. But what we haven't seen is, a consistent increasing trend in water usage. And again, that 10.7 billion gallons per year is on the order of, less than 10% or maybe approaching 10% of the annual recharge that comes back to the aquifer through precipitation in an average year. So what do we make of that, right? You know, clearly the aquifer, the drinking water supply is a relatively small demand on the aquifer as a whole. But there are certainly some challenges, and many of these are things that we talked about when I presented the drought updates to the commissioners earlier last year in the summer and fall. So certainly the climate and weather conditions, like the fact that we just saw a multi-year drought, which followed pretty closely after having record high levels. So that's I think something we're going to see more, which is more extremes. But whether we see a trend in either a drier or wetter direction is hard to say. There are also several federal initiatives kind of working their way through federal regulatory processes. So the proposed PFAS, primary drinking water standard, certainly lead and copper rule improvements and lead pipes are a big focus at the federal level. Uh, Again, one of the issues with most of the infrastructure on Cape Cod is peak demand in the summer. And when you're talking about water supplies, that is really the most challenging time to have to meet a peak demand because the temperatures are higher, plant activity is at its greatest, and so you have evaporation and you have plants withdrawing water through their root system and then evaporating it to the atmosphere. All of that is happening at its peak rate when we have the most visitors also wanting to use water for drinking, showering, etc. And just understanding that siting of new wells is a time-consuming process, and the land area that's available for new water supply exploration it is pretty limited just because so much of the available land has been built out. Uh, and then, of course, just thinking about the actual distribution systems themselves, knowing kind of the age of some of the water systems, the fact that pumps, pipes, and controls, may be nearing kind of end of design life, and needing to have system redundancy available either for maintenance. So this might be, if a particular well has to be taken offline because the pump needs to be replaced, for instance. Or as we've seen, if wells need to be taken offline to have treatment installed uh, for other reasons, redundancy is really important for maintaining service. And of course, redundancy could be within a particular department or district, or it can be facilitated through interconnections among different districts through things like the Upper Cape Water Supply. So those are all examples that have already been utilized, but maybe worth kind of re-examining. And so that is it for slides I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Commissioner Bergstrom. Well, just to say that, we can look at the issues that we face here in water quality just from the standpoint of Cape Cod. But if you take the broader look at it, you find that issues with water quality occur all over the country. And we're fortunate in the sense that what goes into our water comes from Cape Cod. We can control it. It doesn't come downstream from some farming area or a large watershed. And, when I first came to the Cape with Lolo's many years ago, the quality of the water impressed me then. You turn your tap on, you got clear water, it didn't have any odor to it, it was tasty. And in many ways, it's still that way. I mean, obviously there are issues and things that we can't see and taste or smell, but I think, to be honest with you, that we're doing a pretty good job here on Cape Cod of maintaining high water quality, and we have no control over the rainfall and so on. people see the signs on the roads in my town and other towns saying, water conservation, they can only water their lawns on alternate days. And I think it's important to point out that doesn't have to do with the, the amount of water in the ground. It's really about our ability to pump it. It gets down too low and there's too much of a demand, and the infrastructure becomes difficult to keep up. So, there's a lot of bad news have been in the press and so on about the challenges we face, but by and large, I think we have done a good job with our water resources, and hopefully, with the county initiative and other initiatives, that'll continue. Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Lyons.
Yeah, Tim, thank you. That was a really nice presentation. And so my thing is always going back to the drought. So, we had a severe drought. It has been not as severe. So I'm going to ask you, how's it going with our water table? But what I take away from this is that our water, indeed, as well managed as it may be, is a finite resource. And we really have to be very conscious about its use. I look at, towns struggling with people wanting to increase their house size, which also means the capacity of that house, the people who can be in that house. So therefore, the people who are using the resources. So it may be one house, but it's bigger, it has more people, and more water is being used. And we keep, unfortunately, a lot of building has happened here without really thinking, are we going to be able to maintain this? So I do think that although we do a good job, it is something that we have to be always aware of, because it is finite, and it's not as though we have other sources. We are sort of an island on our own with our own water. So how is our water table in comparison to when the drought was?
Yeah, so
Improvement back. I know that might have not been one of your questions that you were prepared for, but if you have even a few months ago recent data, how's it doing?
Sure. Yeah, so I don't have all of the detailed stuff that I would have presented strictly for the drought, but the drought task force has basically ceased meetings for the winter because the recovery essentially throughout the entire Commonwealth was sufficient to take, I believe, every region out of drought status, but certainly Cape Cod, especially, which received well above average precipitation in some of the early months of this calendar year.
Right. We had a lot of rain,
Has
no snow.
Yeah. So there's been a pretty dramatic recovery. Again, I always want to caution that report, which is to say it's a recovery, back to sort of median type of levels for this time of year, which with several months of drought conditions again could very quickly become a drought, with drought conditions kind of as indicated by all of the different metrics, the surface water levels, the groundwater levels, the kind of uh, fire index, and those other sorts of things. So I always want to be cautious about saying that the drought is over, because we've seen this is not just kind of a several month thing, but it may be a several year cycle of what is going on with both the intensity of precipitation and also the location of it. And so we still see um a lot of storms miss certain parts of the Cape, and even though it's treated as a single region for kind of drought reporting purposes, there were several occasions where they had to have the task force had to sort of put an asterisk on a certain portion of Cape Cod to say, well, everywhere else has recovered pretty well, except for, as of late, it was kind of the like Chatham kind of mid lower Cape elbow area essentially just missed a lot of the storms that either went south and hit the islands or went north and kind of caught both the upper Cape and Provincetown, but missed the elbow.
Right.
So So yeah, I think that's probably the best summary I can give, and it's certainly something that we'll keep an eye on and hope that we don't have to jump back into the same frequency of updates that we had this previous summer and fall. But things are looking much better right now than they were the last time that I was in front of the commissioners, for sure.
Thank you.
That's great. Hey, Tim, could you do me a favor and put up back on the screen the map or the drawing that shows the zone twos of the public water supplies?
Yep. Give me just a moment to navigate back there.
Would be great. There you go, right
This
there.
one?
Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things that it's very revealing in this particular slide is the extent to which each lens has its own set of, I would say, challenges. Last summer, I was really heartened to see, with respect to the Monomoy lens, the water departments in all of the communities drawing water from that lens, collaborating in terms of their overall water conservation policies. You can see clearly a very focused effort looking at protecting the resource and managing withdrawals in that area. And I think one of the things that we're beginning to see are communities focusing on what's happening with the lens in their jurisdiction. When I worked in the manager's office in Provincetown, I learned quite quickly that Provincetown's Pilgrim lens was no longer capable. Actually, it wasn't capable for years in providing a drinking water supply to the town of Provincetown because of the high mineral content of the water. So Provincetown needed to get its water from Truro. And the point I'm getting here is that this resource is a resource that transcends political boundaries. Each of these lenses, its health depends on the collaboration and the working relationships among multiple political bodies. And the Sagamore lens, which is where you can see an abundance of zone 2 delineations, but it's also the largest area of public water supplies, you can see multiple jurisdictions having a role in the overall health of the lens, but also in the overall health of the water supply. And I think, every now and then when we think about county government and regionalism and why it's important to have a regional government, I think looking at these slides periodically is a good starting point, because these resources can't be managed by one community unto their own. They have to be managed collectively. And I think it's important that here at the county, we have a very robust groundwater team at the commission. And we have all of the other departments with their role in terms of water testing, water resources management, because this is really the challenges in each of these areas are challenges that we are all going to have to be focused on in the years ahead. And I'm glad that the Board of Commissioners has been very focused on the Sagamore lens and some of the activity going on in the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve. I think this map shows why that area was designated as a water supply reserve. The entire reserve area is considered a zone 2 because literally what goes on there has an impact on the drinking water supplies of all the surrounding towns. And as we could see from the map earlier, that water flows down through Barnstable and into Yarmouth. So I like staying focused on this for just a couple of moments, because I think it sort of is very revealing in terms of where we're getting our water. And as Tim said, and I think this is an excellent point, is looking ahead, we're not going to see that change too much. All right, as he mentioned, that land areas for future water supply areas and for future delineated zone 2s, we're not going to see much change there. The focus is going to continue to be on finding ways to make sure that those are protected and sustained for long-term use, and that we find ways to address land uses that may present threats. And when I look at this, I'm thinking of the additional equipment that we're spending money on at the county for PFAS testing, the work that the county health department's talking about in terms of doing more investigations, in terms of where there may be potential PFAS contamination sites. I think I like seeing the county being very proactive and looking forward in this initiative because these areas of all the land uses on the Cape, it's with those land uses within these areas that are critical in terms of our ability to provide water to our people. Commissioner Lyons.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to, number one, it's interesting that it was only 1982 that this was designated as a sole source aquifer, and what designates a sole source aquifer. And I believe in one of your first or two slides, it says, one of the things is that any activity that may have some negative impact precludes assistance from the government to help with that effort. Maybe it's the one before.
No, I don't know. It's right
Right,
there.
the
in
box
the
in the middle, it says specifically the
Right,
designation
right.
precludes. Now, does it
Yeah.
say may contaminate, Tim, or does it
It
say
says may
may
contaminate.
contaminate?
As right here, it
Yep.
says may
May
contaminate
contaminate.
the aquifer, which to me speaks to the base that they shouldn't be looking around up there because they already know. And there shouldn't be any federal money being put into that because, so I'm just pointing out sort of an obvious point, but that is stated right there about part of what makes that designation. And I also have
Well,
another,
before you go,
Okay.
let me just add a point. That's the reason why the EPA is actually
Right.
doing a review under the Safe Drinking Water Act,
Mhm.
under these provisions, looking at that machine gun range
the
project
range,
that
right.
we've expressed some real serious concerns about.
and I'm sure that the aquifer designation came all about around that same time when it was being discovered and confirmed that that activity did do something to the drinking water supply.
Actually, I
Around
can
that same
I
time.
can recall and again, it was back then the Cape Cod Planning and Economic Development Commission, through their Water Resources Management Program, they're the ones that actually requested EPA make the designation
Mhm.
as a tool to help us protect the water
Right.
resources here at the
I
Cape.
can
I'm
see
not
that.
sure that they had any specific issues related there at the time, but I think we've learned since the designation that having it, given what's been going on there, has been very important.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, I want to go back to aesthetics a little bit. One of the good incentives for water conservation is the fact that not every well is created equal. Some wells have manganese in them, some wells have nothing dangerous, but less desirable from an aesthetic standpoint. I know in my town, we have several different wells. And if we are to drill other wells, we would have to treat them more extensively, not because they're dangerous, once again, because they have
Mineral content.
manganese or other chemicals in them. So it becomes expensive. And also, as we expand public drinking water supplies to areas which may have slight contamination from PFAS and some other things, that becomes more expensive. So there's a price tag to be paid for being, inconsiderate of our environment. But as far as the drought goes, there's a little public beach on a kettle hole pond in Chatham. And there's a parking lot and there's a beach and then there's the water. And in some years, there's a big beach where everybody can put their blankets down. And in some years, you're practically up against the parking lot. And I think right now we're doing pretty well. The kettle hole pond behind my house is right up to the grass. So there's plenty of water there right now. Who knows how long that'll last.
Right.
But yeah, we've got to consider not just the quality of the water is one thing, but the expense that we're going to incur if anything happens to our water and we have to use public water supplies with massive treatment is going to be huge. So the money that Yarmouth is spending and Chatham has spent for protecting water quality is money well spent in the long run.
Yeah, I think maybe in our next discussion of groundwater, we can talk about saltwater intrusion and upwelling of other types of issues. But I'm going to stop right there, Tim. We could probably talk for another hour on this topic. A wealth of information, incredibly helpful. Thanks for joining us and giving us some insight on the work that's going on in your department with keeping tabs on what's happening with our water supplies and water resources. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, commissioners. Appreciate the opportunity.